Welcome, everybody. I hope everybody has got their morning drink. Coffee means coffee, tea, uh, ginger tea, health drink, whatever. Today we have Graham Saul, who is the CEO of Nature Canada. He is a dynamic and passionate speaker and advocate. He has a lifetime of social justice and environmental advocacy behind him. And at the moment at Nature Canada, he has succeeded in increasing the park space in the country, which is essential to us now, substantially. And I remember down in 1992, when these same two crises were dealt with at the United Nations conference in Rio, the Biodiversity Convention and the Climate Change Convention were signed. And as I was watching that, I had a lot of hope that we would rationally take the science seriously, and humanity would do something about it. Unfortunately, so far we have not been so rational. We have been in denial. We have, unfortunately, a certain amount of ignorance about our connection to nature and that we are part of species extinction. Unlike Unitarians, not everybody has a rule for respecting the interconnected web of life. And today we have Graham with solutions for us, which is once again giving us hope. So I'm looking forward very much to hearing everything he has to say. And over to you, Graham.
Thank you very much, Susan, and thanks very much for the invitation. I'm looking at the people that have joined us today, and there's so many names I see who I know are such a dynamic presence across such a range of issues in Ottawa. And so it's really testament to the Unitarian commitment to social and environmental justice and engagement in communities. And I want to thank you for having the opportunity to talk today. Yeah, I've been at this stuff in one form or another for about 25 years. First in sub-Saharan Africa, where I worked with Oxfam for 5 years, and then in Washington, D.C., where I focused primarily on climate change and the environment as it pertained to corporate globalization issues, including the role of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And then since coming to Ottawa with Climate Action Network as their executive director there, a coalition of about 100 Canadians pushing for action on climate change, and then Ecology Ottawa, where I had the pleasure of working with many of you. And then a few years ago, I transitioned to Nature Canada. So I want to move towards the screen share, and I'm going to say a few words about Nature Canada, but then also as Susan was saying, really try to get into some of the more fundamental questions about the role of nature in Canada, Canada's amazing responsibility for stewarding our natural landscapes and nature. I want to talk a little bit about the fact that nature is in crisis. As Susan alluded to early on, I do want us to be conscious of the scale of the problem. But I also think whenever we talk about the scale of the problem, we also have a responsibility to think about the solutions, because in many ways there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and it's not necessarily a train coming from the other direction. We stand at a very sort of exciting moment in history where a few really terrible problems are lurking, climate change, mass extinction being among them, but also a moment when we have a chance to really redefine who we are and how we relate to the natural world and the responsibilities and ethics that we take on. So, by way of introduction, I've told you a little bit about myself. I want to tell you a little bit about Nature Canada. Nature Canada has been working as a nonprofit charitable organization, a national nature and conservation organization in Canada for 80 years. In that sense, we are one of the most experienced nature not-for-profit charitable organizations in the country. And I sometimes like to describe us as having three sort of core kinds of work that we do. Um, we are a nature nation. We're a community of nature lovers. 100,000 Canadians working together to discover, defend, and restore nature. Another 100,000 on social media, and we're a growing community of people who care about nature. A lot of our background really comes from the naturalist community in terms of the birders and botanists and the people who really fundamentally like to get into the details of nature. But in fact, we also think of ourselves as engaging nature lovers more broadly. I myself am more of a hiker than a naturalist, but obviously love nature and enjoy it in all of its fashions. We're also a nature network. There are literally thousands of groups across Canada that are working on nature-related issues. And one of the reasons I joined Nature Canada was because in many ways I think the nature community is the largest part of Canada's environmental movement. No matter how small the community you go into, you'll find the Trail Association trying to make some nice trails down by the river. You'll find the Watershed Association. You'll find the birders, the botanists, the local land trust. You'll find the canoe or the kayak club or the hiking club. And really, the nature network or the thousands of groups across the country that are engaged in nature issues are in many ways the closest thing to a real grassroots climate change, grassroots environmental movement that we have in the country. I think the community also um, has a long way to go in terms of thinking through some of the systemic dimensions of the crisis we're in, as well as working together in an integrated way. And that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in Nature Canada. And then, of course, we're expert staff working on federal policy in Canada. We're based in Ottawa. We are, in many ways, we were at one stage called the Canadian Nature Federation. And that's because our raison d'etre really is to not just work with, support, engage, and mobilize nature groups across the country, but be an effective voice for those local and regional nature organizations. And there's really nowhere in Canada where, I would argue there's nowhere in the world, I mean, where we have more of a responsibility in terms of our relationship to nature. I'm really not sure that there are, in fact, 37 million people in the world that have a greater responsibility for taking care of the planet's natural beauty and heritage. Consider some of the following. This is you often hear that Canada has 20% of the world's freshwater resources. Um, and I think that that's an absolutely amazing concept, that sort of 1 in 5 buckets of fresh water on planet Earth can be found in Canada in the hundreds of thousands of lakes and wetlands and rivers that run across our country. We actually also have 24% of the world's wetlands. And wetlands, if forests are the lungs of the world, wetlands really are in many ways the circulatory system. Working to cleanse water and move and protect and play host to such a great diversity of animal and plant and insect species. We also have about 25% of the planet's temperate rainforests. We're one of only 3 places in the world where these temperate rainforests can be found, along with sort of Argentina, Chile, and New Zealand. And if you're like me, you've really fallen in love with the amazing moist temperate rainforests of the West Coast. But then, of course, we have 33% of the world's remaining boreal forest as well. And there is more carbon. There's actually twice as much carbon stored in Canada's boreal forest than there is in all the world's proven oil reserves combined. So the boreal forest is not just a place where billions of birds fly into every year and billions more fly out, and incredible wetlands and ecosystems, but it is also a massive and almost unparalleled store of greenhouse of carbon. And then we have the longest coastline in the world, measuring 200,000 kilometers in comparison to the United States at 19,000 and Russia at 37,000. Of course, a lot of this is the many islands in the Arctic, and along the west coast. But we don't just kind of have the longest coastline in the world. We have the longest coastline by far, by an order of magnitude almost in comparison to the United States. So like I said earlier, there really isn't a place where you could argue that 37 million people have a greater responsibility for caring for the world's natural landscape and nature. Um, and I would be entirely remiss if I didn't point out that we're at a very important moment in Canadian history where reconciliation is a critical dimension of our evolution as a country, and ethically in responding to some of the history of colonialism in Canada, and in many ways the nature agenda, whether it's Indigenous protected and conserved areas or Indigenous-led conservation of all kinds, represents a real opportunity for us to advance the reconciliation agenda, to provide support to Indigenous communities, to show the leadership they want to show, and to learn from them on a variety of conservation-related issues. So when I say nature unites us, I don't just mean no matter where you go across what is sometimes a fractured country, nature is one of the dominant themes about how we relate to our life, but it's also one of the building blocks for a very important reconciliation that we need to go through in Canada with Indigenous communities. There are 700 Indigenous communities in the boreal forest alone, for instance. At the same time, nature is definitely in crisis in a way that is sometimes hard to grasp. To fully get your head around the scale of the problem that we are facing. So recent United Nations reports, some of the most exhaustive reports of their kind, have found that unsustainable human activity has severely altered the marine environment. 40% of the marine environment, 50% of inland waterways, and 75% of the planet's land. So the scale of humanity's impact on the ocean, fresh water, and land around the world is really profound over the past in recent decades. And related to that is also very much a shift in life on Earth in many ways. So 96% of the mass of mammals on the land right now is us and our livestock. Only about 4% is everything else: the pandas, the bears, the elephants, everything that is wild that we think of as mammals in nature. And that's really a profound transformation over the past several hundred years in terms of, or a couple hundred years in terms of the balance of life on Earth. Similarly, and this is another one of those things that's hard to really get your head around, as many as 1 million species are currently gravitating towards extinction. There's about 8 or 9 million species in the world, according to best estimates by the United Nations. About 1 million of them are gravitating towards extinction. So that's what we're talking about when people talk about the 6th mass extinction, and the scale of it is completely unprecedented since the 5th mass extinction that wiped out the dinosaurs. In practice, what that means is over half of the world's population of fish, birds, and mammals have been wiped out in the past 4 or 5 decades. So if you were born 50 years ago, as I was, there were twice as many fish, birds, and mammals on planet Earth as there are today. More than 40% of the world's insect species are declining. A third of them are in danger. And North America is not immune to this. We have lost 3 billion birds in North America since 1970. 3 billion over the course of my lifetime. There are 3 billion fewer birds. And from 1970 to 2014, half of the monitored wildlife species in Canada were in decline. So about half of the species that we're currently monitoring are declining, and among that population that is declining, they declined by an astounding 83% on average. What's driving this? We are destroying the homes of other species, expansion of agriculture and urban development. We are poisoning the homes and habitat of other species in terms of toxins and air and noise, water, light pollution, invasive species, increased competition for depleted resources. Climate change is a growing threat. I mean, it's really important to point out that if someone waved their wand right now and magically returned the world to 350 parts per million and solved the climate change problem, the problems I've talked about thus far would not be very affected by that. If you can solve the climate change problem and have almost no impact right now on mass extinction and species collapse. However, there is no way to solve mass extinction and species collapse and allow the climate change crisis to unfold. If we're going to deal with the broader problem of extinction, we're going to have to deal with the problem of climate change. Disease and parasitism and overexploitation. I think the COVID crisis has also brought home the relationship between the destruction of nature and our own frailty as a society. So the good news is that there is a lot that can be done, much like the climate change crisis, where ultimately we need to ramp up renewable energy and energy efficiency and phase out the burning of oil, coal, and gas, and also invest in natural climate solutions that can store and sequester greenhouse gas emissions. In Canada, or in relation to the species collapse, what I sometimes like to describe it, and this is one of the ways we describe it at Nature Canada, is we need to discover, defend, and restore nature. In terms of discover, this is important at a couple different levels. It's really important that we understand that the amount of time we spend in nature, especially as young people, and our connection and love of it are related. And it's very important that we get ourselves into nature, in part because we need to be cultivating that bond. But at the same time, it's also very clear, and there are so many ways to immerse yourself in nature. There's so many ways to connect with nature. And there are so many ways, even in urban areas, to get exposure to nature. And this is good for nature and for the movement as a whole, but it's also really good for us, right? The connection between physical and mental benefits and of time in, or the physical and mental benefits of time in nature are very well established and increasingly well established. Spending time in nature enhances the speed that we recover from illness and illness and surgery. It reduces psychosis and substance abuse. They've done studies which have actually done correlations between the number of antidepressants on the street and the amount of access to nature. It improves feelings of peace and self-awareness and wellness. There's clearly a link between the amount of nature in our lives and our sense of place. And it provides a place for reflection and clarification of personal values. The growing evidence of the benefits of nature on children is, there's fabulous research being done, a lot of which is being done by the Health and Active Living and Obesity working group at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, who are doing some great work on just the fact that it's just very clear that children score better than usual on their attention span when they spend time outside. Spending time outside enhances social, cognitive, emotional, and physical development of children. It alleviates symptoms of anxiety, depression, and psychosomatic illness. Higher amounts of exposure to natural environments are associated with lower levels of stress, reduction in muscle tension, and improves ability to recover from stressful episodes. So we need to defend nature and restore nature because it's good for us, as well as because um, nature has an inherent right to continue to exist and thrive in this world. And there are, in fact, thousands of groups across the country, as I mentioned earlier, that are all about getting people into nature. And so I would really encourage people, as I know many of you already are, to associate yourself with local organizations. It's not just all about the politics and the systemic need for change. A lot of it is about the very local action that we can take at a grassroots level to build the kind of world that we want to build. And Nature Canada is very proud to work with these and hundreds of other organizations in terms of trying to both take local and specific action, as well as address more systemic problems. But there's also a real need to defend nature. We are losing our intact ecosystems. And one of the most important things that we can do as a society is to expand protected areas. And right now, we're lucky enough to have a federal government that seems to care about this issue. The Government of Canada has committed to protecting 17% of Canada's land and water and 10% of its ocean by 2020. It's actually going to surpass that from an ocean perspective, and it's going to fall short of it from a land and freshwater perspective. But this was a commitment that they made within the context of the Global Convention on Biological Diversity, which is sort of the equivalent of the UN climate negotiations, but from a biodiversity perspective. And that agreement is currently being renegotiated. And I think the best available science is telling us that we really need to establish protected areas covering about 30 to 70% of the planet's surface if we want to really provide an opportunity for the abundance of nature to restore itself. Nature Canada, we often say nature needs half. But as interim goals within the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity, we're talking about trying to get to 25% of land, freshwater, and oceans by 2025 and 30% by 2030. And to give you a bit of a sense of the scale of that, if we were to go we're currently at about 12 or 13% in terms of protection of land and freshwater. If we went from 12 or 13% to 30% over the next decade, that would be equivalent to protecting an area of Canada almost the size of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba combined. So this is one of those really big ideas that is commensurate with the scale of the problem we are facing. Much like when we hear the federal government talking about getting to net zero greenhouse gas emissions, it's expanding protected areas to 30% of Canada's land, freshwater, and ocean is a visionary major goal. And we all have a role to play in supporting and demanding that governments follow through on that. The federal government does seem to say they want to do it. It's very positive that we're moving in that direction. I don't think we know how we're going to get there. It's going to require significant support to provinces and territories, and especially Indigenous communities who are often showing leadership around Indigenous protected and conserved areas. But it's not enough to just be defending intact ecosystems, because we have unfortunately already gone too far. There is too much of our land and water and ocean that is already degraded. And when you look at a heat map of Canada, which shows, and this image here shows the areas where there's the highest concentration of endangered species in Canada, you can see that there's obviously a massive correlation between where we are and where the highest concentration of endangered species are. It's because at its fundamental level, it's a habitat destruction question. And so we have to stop thinking about just slowing the damage. We have to stop thinking about just protecting what's left. And we have to, as people who love nature and love life on Earth, we have to adopt a posture that says, no, we don't just want to slow the rate of destruction, we want to reverse it. And we want to begin to restore degraded ecosystems. We want to move into areas and restore abundance. We want to bring species back. We want to transition from urban areas filled with nothing but concrete to urban areas that have more trees, more canopy, more natural infrastructure. We want to move from agriculture that is in many ways a biodiversity dead zone to agriculture that is storing carbon, that is restoring life with more trees on the borders, more diversity. And in these places, we want to really think about not just how do we slow the damage, but how do we turn the tide. You can see here that the government of Canada is in fact thinking about, up until now, our approach to species extinction has really been, let's find the species, let's assess the species rate of decline, and then let's try to protect that species. And now we're beginning in Canada to move towards saying, no, we need to protect entire zones and ecosystems. We need to think that it's not just a question, and when I say protect, I also mean restore. Helping species bounce back in southern Canada is about looking at landscapes and thinking, how do we approach the problem with a view to restoring landscapes and allowing multiple species to come back, as opposed to just one species at a time. And these are some of the regions that the government of Canada has currently identified as areas with the highest concentration of endangered species, where they're trying to take a multi-species action plan approach to the problem of species decline. And there are good stories. Like, this is one of the things we really have to hold on to. When we stopped polluting our land and water with DDT in the 1970s, raptor populations have bounced back. The eagles, the osprey, the falcons, there are more of them than there used to be. This is demonstrated evidence that life will restore itself if we create the space and stop destroying the habitat. Otters on the West Coast, reintroduced in the 1970s. Another great example of what we can do if we stop actually actively seeking to hunt and then also often unknowingly destroy the sea life and the food and the habitat of these species. Swift fox is another good example. I mean, most people don't know that the Canada goose was once a very vulnerable species. And for those of us in southern Ontario, the wild turkeys were once, they had to be reintroduced. They were reintroduced several times in southern Ontario before they caught hold. And you can see them quite often now in farmers' fields and places across southern Ontario. So the moral of the story is life can bounce back. Right? If we take action, we can begin to not just slow the rate of decline, but restore and rewild areas. And for me, I think of restoration, it occurs, I see a variety of sort of concentric circles that emanate from me. One is my home, my workplace. What is the footprint? How can I rewild or restore nature? But then it's also my neighborhood. And then it's my city, and then it's my province and my country and my planet. At each one of these levels, we should have goals for what can we achieve as individuals, as families, as communities, as cities, as provinces, as countries, as planet, to not just slow the rate of decline, but to actually begin to restore the abundance of life on Earth. And at each one of these different levels, we all have our own agency, and at each one of these different levels, we need more and more leadership from government. We need government to step up and make the kinds of investments that are necessary. So you can participate as an individual in the thriving local ecosystem of groups, including Unitarian congregations, but groups like Ecology Ottawa and others that are taking action at a neighborhood and community level. You can participate in a wide variety of different kinds of local and regional nature groups. I encourage you to please act. One of the challenges of the nature community is that we often don't think clearly about the critical importance of political change. There is no way. What we do at in our homes and communities are important, but there is no way to solve this problem if we don't demand action from government and other institutions. And one of the things I like to say to nature organizations is, I'm not saying you've got to grab your pitchfork and light your torches and storm your constituency office. I'm saying that if they don't even know, if your elected leaders don't even know that you care about these issues, if you're not taking the time to tell them, whether it's through phone calls or events or email actions, then why would you ever expect them to do something about the problem? And so act, make sure your decision makers know. And I would be completely remiss, because I truly believe this. Also, please donate. And I'm saying this about Nature Canada, obviously. We're always very happy to receive donations at Nature Canada, but I mean this regardless of where you choose to donate your money. It's really critically important to organizations, the donations that people make. So I want to thank you for your time this morning. Happy to answer questions and happy to have a conversation. And I really want to say from the bottom of my heart, I mean, the Unitarians are an inspiration in terms of your commitment to social and environmental justice. And as I said earlier, so many of the people on this Zoom today are people that I've had the pleasure of working with at Ecology Ottawa or other local manifestations. And so I really want to thank you for the work that you do and your commitment to climate change and nature and a fair world, because I also really believe, and I didn't get into this today, but it's imperative that we also start looking at some of the systemic obstacles that certain communities face to accessing nature, and that we ensure that there's equitable access to nature in this country because of the benefits that it ensues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Graham, for that excellent summary and passionate suggestions for what we can do. I'm reminded that we usually start our sessions with an acknowledgement that our church in particular, but all of us are living on Indigenous territory. And I'd like to follow that up with a question. You mentioned Indigenous activities and the need for reconciliation. And we're particularly interested in the teachings about love and the knowledge of nature from the Indigenous communities. And we're very grateful for their leadership in this area in our country at the moment, particularly in relation to pipelines. And I'm wondering if you could comment a bit on the fact that the learnings start in childhood, they're raised with these values. I know that Nature Canada does a great deal of education work, and I think I used to have a newsletter that my children used when they were younger. And I also work with another group called Learning for a Sustainable Future that does curricula on nature education. And I'm wondering if you could make some comments about learning about the interconnected web of life.
Yeah, Nature Canada has a program called Naturehood, which is we work with about 15 or 20 organizations across the country that are running programs to get children and their families into nearby nature. And we also try wherever we can to promote the importance of childhood immersion in nature. I mentioned earlier that some of the more interesting research that I've ever seen on the physical and mental health benefits of immersion in nature is actually coming out of Eastern Ontario. The healthy active living and obesity clinic at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario is doing some really interesting work on this, and the Nature Canada board actually had an opportunity to see a presentation from one of their researchers, and I would highly recommend it in terms of potential future talks for this group, because it really is fascinating to watch the research evolve. I mean, when you ask people who care deeply about nature and the environment where they got that from, they'll often have a story about the tree. Stephen Guilbeault tells the story of coming home one day, who's now a member of parliament, previously an environmental activist in Quebec. He came home one day and complained to his mother that they were that they were going to cut down a tree he really liked in the local park when he was quite young. And his mother said, well, why don't you do something about it? And he went up and climbed the tree and sat in it and actually rallied people to stop the cutting. But for many people, it's those walks in local parks and camping trips when we're young. And evidence really does show that there's a clear correlation between people's willingness to take action to defend nature and the degree to which they feel that they have a strong attachment to it, and that attachment is often really founded at a young age. And so supporting and running programs designed to get kids to get access to nature is extremely important. And one of the things we're trying to do at Nature Canada now is also put much more emphasis on engaging racialized communities. So within our program, we are diversifying our partners so that we're working with more partner organizations that are more directly engaging racialized communities who often face systemic barriers and cultural barriers to accessing nature. We have established an advisory committee of leaders from racialized communities that are nature leaders across the country that are advising us on how to proceed with that. And we're in the process of well, we've hired a couple leading thinkers to do some research into that. The question of Indigenous leadership is obviously so much more complicated because Nature Canada would never put ourselves in a position where we think we can, teach Indigenous communities the importance of connection to nature.
Right.
Really, that's something that the leadership around Indigenous-led conservation is happening already in those communities, and we need to find ways to do things like support guardians programs, which are basically we need to create more employment opportunities or support more employment opportunities in Indigenous communities for people to learn about and take care of the land. This is something the Indigenous Leadership Initiative is pushing very hard around. And then it's also a question of, we see Indigenous leadership emerge from the resistance to destruction or invasion of their traditional territory. You mentioned pipelines, which is where that's manifested a lot. It also manifests quite often in terms of forestry related issues. But then we also see Indigenous leadership in terms of the desire to create Indigenous protected and conserved areas. And this is one of those opportunities where Nature Canada's goal of saving life on Earth and species protection intersects directly with our goal to support Indigenous rights and the ability of Indigenous communities to control and claim ownership and or management of land areas. Because if we can support the expansion of Indigenous protected and conserved areas, we will be both advancing Indigenous communities' control or stewardship of their traditional territory, and expanding conservation initiatives at the same time. So there are real opportunities to have an intersection there.
Right. Thank you very much. And mentioning trees and protected areas, you mentioned flora as in habitat protection, and you mentioned Stephen's tree. Could you speak a little bit more about the link between preserving diverse plant species and the animals that depend upon them?
Yeah, I mean, for me, this intersects in a variety of different kinds of ways. And one is the immediate implication of what you've just said, which is that diversity is strength, is resilience. And we have clear evidence that one of the reasons we need to protect intact ecosystems is not just because they tend to be places that still have functioning habitat for species, but because it's clear they are disproportionately important to surrounding ecosystems as well. And so we need to be thinking about, an ecosystem is, as you know, a interconnection of thousands of species that are working in their own way. And the more diversity that exists within those landscapes, the stronger they are. And some species may have slightly more impact in some ways than others, and that's why we often think about kind of apex species. Um, but at the end of the day, it is the insects and the plants and the bacteria and the water and the trees and all of the pieces. It's not, you know, we think about the whales and we think about the caribou and the sea otters and the falcons, but a strong ecosystem really is a diverse ecosystem. The other thing we're increasingly realizing, and this is one of another new area that, I wouldn't say new area, but another area where Nature Canada is putting a lot of emphasis right now, is around nature-based solutions to climate change.
Mhm.
And we're realizing, and this is really where plants and trees, wetlands, peat, um, and forests really begin to come in. I said earlier that the boreal forest in Canada has twice as much carbon stored in it than all of the world's proven oil reserves combined. And that's pretty mind-blowing when you think about what happens if we lose the boreal in a major way. So the federal government has made a commitment to uh, get 30 megatons of greenhouse gas emission reductions from nature-based climate solutions over the next decade. And just to put it in perspective, 30 megatons is not a small amount. So 30 megatons is about as much greenhouse gas emission reductions as they're hoping to get from their clean fuel standard, or depending on equivalency agreements with provinces from their methane reduction. So there's no silver bullet to fighting climate change, and so it's really a whole series of different initiatives. And nature-based climate solutions is a really now a key dimension of the federal government strategy, even though, of course, transitioning to clean energy is the core of the mission. And they don't really know how they're going to get there, right? So they want to plant 2 billion net additional trees. They talk, you know, about wetland restoration and other things, but there's a real opportunity over the next decade to advance biodiversity outcomes and climate change outcomes simultaneously through nature-based climate solutions.
Excellent. And in fact, there are a series of questions about influencing the government, I think, which you've just referred to. And as you have already noted, many Unitarians have done letter writing and phone calls. And we're wondering if there's anything else you might suggest. And maybe we should keep that for the off the record discussion. I don't know. Some people we've had a presentation from Extinction Rebellion to the congregation. But people are also asking, is the concern moving across the political spectrum? Have you noticed it moving into the other, well, the Green Party, of course, but in the other direction to the other parties on environmental issues?
Yeah, I mean, nature is interesting because it's not really broken down as clearly along partisan lines as often as you might think, in the sense that in many ways the federal government has, you know, in the last federal election, the Liberal Party put as much emphasis on nature as the Greens or the NDP did. In fact, if you look at their platforms, probably more. And if you look at sort of the expansion of protected areas in Canada historically, some of the most important things have been done by conservative governments. And in many ways, I mean, what's not conservative about conservation, right? So there's actually, I think, a real opportunity here. And I on the one hand, I don't want to be naive about it, because inevitably when you push for change and when one political party or one government pushes out in front of others, then it becomes a political wedge issue. So I don't want to be naive about the possibility of responding to wildlife decline or species collapse happening in a purely nonpartisan fashion, because just the nature of politics means parties will look for opportunities to be divisive. But at the same time, there really is an opportunity for us to create a constituency of people who care about life on Earth and who say enough is enough in terms of species die off and collapse and extinction, and for that constituency to be truly nonpartisan, for that constituency to be really grounded and represented in every major political party in Canada. And so what I think we really need to do is at its heart, just make sure that all of our decision makers know how much we care about these issues and how much we expect to see action, and to make sure that we do our best to ground these questions about, the notion of losing half of vertebrates over 50 years or a million species gravitating towards extinction. These are questions that we should be able to talk to conservative voters and green voters and NDP voters and liberal voters about. Um, and I do think there are some contradictions in many party platforms where they seem to be concerned about nature and yet attack important climate change policy and programs. Um, but at the end of the day, I imagine a world and a Canada in which we gather a really substantial amount of consensus around the basic notion that it is not okay for us to be losing as much life as we currently are. And I think the Unitarian Church has a real opportunity to make sure that you are talking to your decision makers, no matter what party they're from. And I know that many of the people I'm talking to today are people that are out in the community organizing on a regular basis. And if there's one thing I said participate earlier when I talked about things we can do, but I think I probably should have said organize, organize, organize.
Right. I was going to say, what you're actually saying is more sort of like voting early and often, phoning and writing early and often out in the community. But someone has raised an interesting issue about the COVID challenges, contrast to restructuring the economy in a green way. Maybe you could comment about some of the complaints from the right. Well, I don't think it's only the right, but how do we balance the concern of working people just trying to survive economically now, and the long-term need to address climate change and species extinction
Yeah.
systematically?
Yeah, I mean, the COVID crisis has been so sad and horrible and traumatic in so many different ways, and also so revealing in so many different ways about our relationship to nature. I think it's fair to say that on the one hand, um, viruses like this are made much more likely in a variety of different ways by the destruction of nature.
Yeah.
They are more likely to spread in terms of be born in the first place. They are more likely to populations that might spread them have a harder time dealing with them and not spreading them if there are fewer of them. And the more we encroach on ecosystems, the more likely it is that these kinds of things happen. I think it's also true that it has exposed a kind of real need, what E.O. Wilson might call biophilia, that we have in terms of our connection to nature, the way that people have kind of rediscovered birds in their backyard or become so attached to that walk in the park that they take at the end of the day. Um, and we really crave that connection, and it's become important to us as we kind of think through how we simplify our lives and respond to the current challenge. I've spoken to a wide variety of pollsters over the past 4 months, and they've all kind of said the same thing, that people are talking about sort of a simplification of their life in a way that nature is absolutely critical to that. Whether or not they're connecting that to systemic change is another question. And I think our challenge as people who care about organizing, that we help people connect the increased affection and connection some people have begun to feel and dependence on nature with the systemic need for change to protect it. One of the stories that I really like to tell, and I wrote an op-ed about this for the National Observer recently, is that at the beginning of the Great Depression in the United States, you know, the worst economic recession in American history, Franklin Roosevelt did an interesting thing. He wrote to Congress and he actually called for a massive investment in nature conservation. Depth of the Great Depression, more unemployment than it ever, you know, higher percentage of unemployment than it ever happened in American history. People looking out over a great depression, and here's the President of the United States writing to the U.S. Congress saying, "I'm going to make a massive investment in nature," and it was called the Conservation Corps. And for those of you, and I know many of my favorite Canadians are American, including my wife. When I go hiking in the United States, you can still see the fingerprints of this. Over the course of the next 10 or 15 years or so, thousands of trails were made, millions of people were employed. There were definitely problems with relation to racism and sexism in terms of how the program was operationalized, but 800 new state parks were created. It actually became the most popular program within the what's now widely considered to be a famous moment in American history, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And it was a cornerstone of that, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And Roosevelt was very clear that there was a direct connection between employment and getting and the needs of farmers and protection of our parks and nature. That there was a direct connection. And so now we find ourselves in this moment in Canadian history where we have to ask ourselves, are we building back better? Are we going to look and invest in a green recovery? Or are we just going to reproduce the same problems we had before this crisis struck? And it's really going to be, it's a turning point for Canada, or we're either going to look back on this moment and we're going to say, you know, we made sure that the kinds of investments we needed to make in the economy were also helping deal with inequality and inclusion and nature conservation, or it was the greatest missed opportunity of a generation. And right now, there's a lot of people that are saying, that are pushing back against the notion that what we need is a green recovery. And so there's really never been a more important moment for us to push strongly for the importance of building back better and for the resources that we're going to invest in helping the economy make it through a very difficult period. Those resources need to be geared towards developing a more egalitarian and greener Canada.
Thank you, Graham. And you mentioned National Observer, and I've watched one of your interviews with Linda on the National Observer program. And if anybody has access to the National Observer's interviews, you will really enjoy Graham's and some of the other ones. There are recorded. In terms of green recovery, Graham, we have written letters. We would be interested in any follow-up other than sending the letters again that you can recommend. And I'll mention to the audience right now that Nature Canada, despite the fact that the name has Canada in it, is not part of the government. It is definitely a charity. It survives on its fundraising. And you are all welcome to do that and as part of your action in this area in relation to what to do about nature and climate change. I have one last question here called about what can we do more in urban areas to reduce our impact or to restore our impact. You talked about restoration earlier. In the urban areas, since we're urbanizing so quickly, what suggestions do you have in that area?
Yeah, this is really important because, of course, this is where, 80% of Canadians live in urban areas, including small towns, of course. Um, but um, if we want to build a better world, we need to figure out how to build a better city. And that was a big part of the reason why when I went from working on national and international climate change issues with Climate Action Network Canada to working on municipal and local issues with Ecology Ottawa, I never felt that I had ever done anything more important in my life than working on municipal issues at Ecology Ottawa. Um, and at Ecology Ottawa, they break it down into the living city, the active city, and the renewable city. And I had some influence over that framework, and so I'll just draw on it. In many ways, from a living city perspective, we can create natural infrastructure, increase our tree canopy, think about every little space where we can move towards removing impermeable surfaces and increasing life. And we can do so in a way that integrates and directly responds to the needs of nature, in terms of the kinds of bee hotels or butterfly gardens or pollinator gardens, um, and, um, and trees and bird-friendly cities. There are many ways for us to develop municipalities so that life is as present as possible, and often providing services like slowing down, soaking up, and keeping stormwater clean rather than constantly relying on gray infrastructure. Cities also, in terms of the active cities, how we get around is just so crucial. And we actually have real opportunities in urban areas thanks to a relatively high concentration of people to make public transportation and active transportation, walking, cycling, really the core way in which people get around. And we have to continue to invest in that. And we've probably taken a bit of a hit, not just by some of the more inept dimensions of our new light rail, but also I think the COVID crisis. Um, but Ottawa is nominally on a course to move towards active transportation, complete streets, which are designing streets as though all the needs of all users, ages, and abilities are taken into consideration. For 75 years, engineers designed streets for how fast can we move a car down them. And when you start asking about the needs of people and communities and other modes of transportation and other uses and ages and abilities, and you start designing streets for them, then you start creating a system that simultaneously responds to climate change and in some ways, nature protection. And then finally, the energy transition, right? And there's people on this chat like Mike Fletcher who know far more about this than I do. But what is it now? About half of Ottawa's greenhouse gas emissions come from how we heat, cool, and electrify our homes, offices, and buildings. We can invest in energy efficiency, make major progress on climate change, and also, I've learned a lot from Mike on the HVAC question and how we're actually doing that heating and cooling of buildings, as well as I think doing everything we can to transition towards renewable energy. But at the end of the day, at an urban level, um, and I know this can be a controversial issue in many communities, but there's almost nothing more important than intensification. There's almost nothing more important than intensification. When people come together and when they share walls, they save energy. When their homes are smaller and more efficiently built and their footprint is smaller and more efficiently built, they save energy. And when they're in tightly compact town centers that are connected by public transportation, um, they, um, they save energy. And so the key to the energy revolution and the environmental improvements in Ottawa is very much goes through a redefinition of our neighborhoods so that they're more dense and more intensification so that there's less destruction of nature. Because if we're not building in the downtown area, we're sprawling. And if we're not building up, we're building out. And those are basically the choices we face.
Thank you so much, Graham. Thank you for this excellent presentation, for the information, for the ideas, and for the encouragement for what we are doing and what we need to do. And I'd like to thank you at this point for all you have done, and I know you will continue to do. I mean, it's clear from this presentation the big expanse of what needs to be done and how you have worked on many aspects of it. And you are right, as many Unitarians have worked on many aspects of it, but it needs to be done because it's a complicated topic. And we will now be moving into some spontaneous discussion with people that are online. The actual recorded part of the program will be ended, and so there will be off the record informal discussion, and I hope that's fine with you, Graham. Before we move to that area, we will, I'd like to remind people of what we're doing on the international level in this topic, just on this coming Thursday with the Holtom Lecture on the importance of the United Nations, on its 75th birthday, the importance of the United Nations to all of these topics, which is our congregational focus on climate change. And please take the poster from the Unitarian sites and share it with your friends so that we have a presence on social media and increase our audience.